Americans will file approximately 150 million personal tax returns this April. But for a growing number of Americans, they won't see a tax refund. Instead, they'll owe money, and millions won't be able to pay on time. Today, we have Daniel J. Pilla, tax problem solver for over 40 years and author of over 14 books on tax problem resolution. Dan, you're known as the nation's top tax problem solving expert. What got you involved in this industry?
Well, wait, I've been doing this for 40 years. I got started as a result of problems my father had with the IRS. He had a small business in our hometown of St. Paul, Minnesota, got behind on his employees withholding taxes, and in 1974, the IRS padlocked the doors on his shop, auctioned the equipment off for a couple cents on the dollar, and then a couple years later, they turned their attention to our family home and they tried to seize and sell it for the back tax liability. And that's how I got started. I came home one day, my mom is sitting at the table and she's got this letter from the IRS in her hands and she's reading it, and I come in the door and she hands this thing to me and she says, "What do you make of this?" And I read it and I said, "Well, it looks like they're going to try to take the house." And she said, "What do we do?" And of course, I had no idea what to do. But what I did do is I went down to the local law library. And I started fumbling around in the Internal Revenue Code. And I didn't even know what I was looking for, Wade, because I was 18 years old at the time. So I'm fumbling around in the tax code, not knowing what I'm looking for. And I literally stumbled onto a section of the tax code that deals with taxpayers' rights issues and limits the power of the IRS. And I started reading in this code section. And I didn't get 6 pages into it and discovered that the IRS was proceeding illegally to seize that home. All right, they weren't doing what the law said they had to do. And so, I did what any 18-year-old would do under the circumstances. I sued the IRS. And I found myself in a courtroom in Minneapolis, and the IRS had flown this attorney in from the Justice Department in Washington to have my case thrown out. So I stand up in front of the judge and I say, "Judge, the law says this, and they're not following the law, and they shouldn't be able to get away with this." And I sat down, and my argument was about that policy. It's about all I said. It
worked though, right?
Well, here's what happened. So this attorney from the Justice Department stands up and he starts blathering on about court cases this and statutes that, and I had no idea what this guy was talking about, and I'm not sure he did either. But he was going on and on and on. And when he was finished, the judge looked at him and pointed at me, and he said, "He's right," and he slammed the gavel. And I thought, well, this is easy. But see, here's the fascinating part of the case. What happened is, in between the time that they seized my father's print shop and the time that I was in that courtroom in Minneapolis, 4 or 5 years later, my dad got involved with the tax protester movement. And these are the people that say the tax laws are unconstitutional and that tax laws are voluntary and and all these various goofball arguments that don't work. But see, when people have problems with the IRS, Wade, they get desperate and they cling to any kind of hope, however false that hope may be. They cling to anything as some sort of a salvation from this problem that's killing them, right? And so that's how most tax protesters end up tax protesters. They have an IRS problem and they're clinging to some false hope. And so that's how my dad got involved in that tax protester movement. Well, see, here's the funny thing. In the courtroom that day, it was packed with my dad's tax protester buddies. There was 100 people in the courtroom, most of them tax protesters that also had IRS problems. So they saw the judge slam the gavel, right? By the time I got home to my mother's house, they were lined up at the door. And they said, "Hey, can you help me with my tax problem?" And I said, "Sure, baby, I'm undefeated. Let's go here." And so it literally was an instant practice.
Yeah.
And I approached every problem the same way that I approached my mother's problem. Of course, I stumbled onto the formula with my mother's problem. Mm-hmm. But in every case from that point forward, I approached it with two very simple questions. First of all, what is the IRS doing in this case? Number one. Secondly, what does the law allow them to do? And then I discovered that the answer to that question was 2 different things in about half the cases. The IRS was cheating blind in half the cases. They weren't following the law. And so what I've done ever since in the work that I've done with folks and the books that I've written on helping people deal with the IRS is I lay out very clearly what the law requires and very specifically what a person's rights are to deal with that particular situation. And I show the individual how to use the rights that are in the Internal Revenue Code to make sure that the IRS doesn't run you over in the collection process.
So you have the secret.
Yeah, well, the secret is real simple, and that is make the IRS follow the law. The IRS doesn't follow its own rules most of the time, Wade, and if people understood what their rights are and understood what the limitations of the IRS are, they would never get run over.
Well, speaking of knowing what the limitations are, why do most people get in trouble with the IRS?
Well, there's a number of reasons why folks get in trouble. You know, for my father, he had a small business with a number of employees, and there was a downturn in business, and he didn't pay the employment taxes. You know, for most folks, we can group this together in kind of general terms and say, you know, what happens in most situations is very few people set out to get sideways with the IRS. Nobody wakes up one morning and says to themselves, how can I tick off the IRS today? I know, I'll stop paying my taxes. People don't do that, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't happen. What happens is life throws people a curveball. All right, whether you're a small business person, maybe you lost your job. If you're a wage earner, you lost a job. Maybe there was a natural disaster of some kind, fire, flood, hurricane. This happens all the time. Maybe there was a marital problem. Maybe there was a drug or alcohol abuse problem. Any kind of a situation where life throws a curveball, Wade, puts people into a position where they have to make a choice between paying their taxes and feeding their families. And anybody who's in that position, who has to make that horrific choice, what are they going to do? They're going to feed their families. They're going to feed their families first. They're going to feed their families every time, and then worry about the taxes later. And I'll just give you another common example. You know, starting in 2008, there was such thing as a financial crisis in the United States.
Yeah,
you probably remember.
I remember that.
You know, you pick up a newspaper, you probably remember that.
I heard about that.
I'm telling you, Wade, there wasn't a realtor in the United States of America, not one realtor in the United States of America that didn't have a tax problem because of the way the real estate market crashed during that period of time. And so we see all kinds of problems for all kinds of reasons. Economic downturns, failed business, fire, flood, earthquake, any of those kinds of things, tragic personal circumstances. We've dealt with businesses that were victims of embezzlement. There's any number of reasons that people get in trouble with the IRS. And one of them is tax scams. There's all kinds of tax scams out there that people fall for that end up getting them in trouble with the IRS.
Well, see, I was going to ask you about that. I've heard, I've gotten the calls, by the way, that this is the call from the IRS, and if you don't send me $4,000 right now, sheriff will be at your door in about 15 minutes. Is that true?
It's absolutely not true.
Well,
first of all, you're not getting a call from the IRS. You're getting a call from Department of Treasury Internal Service of the United States, right? That's the call you're getting.
I didn't say that.
It's not. I said that. It's not the Internal Revenue Service.
Right. So, will the IRS ever call you?
Well, in certain circumstances, they'll call you. For example, if you've got an ongoing audit that's happening right now, and you've got an auditor that's working your case, that auditor may call you on the phone.
Somebody you already know.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Somebody you've got an existing relationship with. Could be an auditor, could be a tax collector, could be an appeals officer. And so those phone calls happen all the time. What never happens, Wade, and I mean this never happens, is the IRS will never call you in the first instance. In other words, they're not going to call you up and say, oh, Mr. Smith, Mrs. Jones, you owe the IRS money and you better, and that's the very first call. That never will happen. The IRS is never going to call you on the phone in the first instance. They're never going to send you an email. In every situation, there's no exception. In every situation, you're going to get a letter first. And if it's an audit situation, the letter's going to say, dear Mr. and Mrs. Smith, your tax return for 2017 has been selected for audit. We want the following documents. If it's a collection situation, you're going to get notices in the mail. You owe this, you owe that. These notices are going to set up certain deadlines and certain steps that you have to take to deal with the situation. But you're never going to get a phone call in the first instance.
So don't believe that.
Well, not only that, but they're never going to call you on the phone, and I mean never, and I don't care what your situation is. They're never going to call you on the phone and say, unless you pay $2,500 by noon tomorrow, we're sending somebody out to arrest you. That will never, ever happen.
There you go. You heard it. You heard it right there. Okay, so let's say that someone actually does owe the IRS money and they've had a wage garnishment or a lien or something like that. How do you go about getting rid of that?
Well, let's take a step back.
Okay.
And let's say when you understand what your rights are, you're never going to get to that position. All right, in my book, How to Get Tax Amnesty, I take you step by step through the process of avoiding those levies in the first place. And this is critically important because wage levies and bank levies and garnishments, they wipe you out. I mean, the IRS can literally grind you into financial powder if you get into that situation. So How to Get Tax Amnesty puts you into a position where you're never going to get there in the first place.
Okay, so let's say I've got a levy. Now, how do I get that levy released? How do you do that?
All right, well, first of all, you got to understand that the IRS cannot, this is a matter of law now, this is not discretion on their part. They cannot maintain a levy in force that's causing a hardship. A hardship is defined as the inability to pay necessary living expenses. So if you've got a levy in place right now
that's hurting
you, then you as a matter of law have the right to get that levy released. The best way to do that is every state in the country has an office called the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate. The Taxpayer Advocate can step in and act as a liaison between you and the IRS in a situation where the IRS is taking steps that are causing harm. A levy is such a step. So in How to Get Tax Amnesty, I show you exactly how to use that Taxpayer Advocate office to get that levy released. What you have to do is demonstrate hardship, and that means that you've got to present financial information to the IRS, income and expenses, assets and liabilities, to show them that the levy is putting you into a position where you can't pay your living expenses.
These are things that most people just don't know.
They have no idea.
They have no idea. And they can. This is going to be spelled out in how to get tax amnesty in your book, right?
Step by step by step. I show you exactly how to release a levy, whether it's a wage levy or a bank levy, and then to put yourself into a position where the IRS can't execute further levies.
Wow. I'm glad I met you. So I've heard that, see, this is all things that I've actually wanted to know my entire life. I've heard that if you owe the IRS, you owe the IRS to your death, and then my kids will owe the IRS after I die. Is that correct?
Yeah, both things are incorrect.
Really?
Yeah. First, let's work backwards. Okay. First of all, when you owe the IRS money, it's your liability. All right. The IRS cannot push that liability onto anybody else. So your kids don't owe it. If it's a separate tax liability, not even your wife owes it. All right. Depends on what state you live in. Some states are community property, but for the general rule is that your debt is your debt. It's like a car loan. You know, if you got a car loan, the car company, the lending company can't come to your kids and make your kids pay the car loan. All right. So this is the tax assessment is the same thing. It's your liability. But now, one of the other things I talk about in How to Get Tax Amnesty is probably the best known or the best kept secret that the IRS has. And that is there's a statute of limitations on the IRS's right to collect taxes. They cannot chase you to your grave.
I did not know that. The statute of limitations, there's a certain time frame and there's a spot in which they say, oh, we just got to stop chasing.
Exactly right.
It's the county line, I got to turn around.
It's a county line, you got to turn around. It's a good way to put it. The fact of it, and here's how it works. The IRS has 10 years from the date of assessment in which to collect the tax. Now, that's a long time, but it's not the rest of your life, right? So once the tax is assessed, that is to say recorded as a debt on the books, that clock starts running. And if they can't collect within 10 years, they can't collect at all. And I've worked numbers of cases, and I got examples in How to Get Tax Amnesty of people that have walked away from $100, $500, $1 million worth of tax liability because the statute of limitations ran out.
Now, I've heard that if you're in trouble with the IRS, they can there's penalties involved, right? So do you know how to get rid of the penalties?
Oh yeah, listen, penalties are a big problem. I've heard people tell me 1,000 times, I can pay my taxes, it's the penalties and interest that are killing me. And so one of the things I talk about in How to Get Tax Amnesty is the fact that every single penalty provision of the tax code has what's called a good faith or reasonable cause provision. And what that means very simply is if you acted in good faith and based on a reasonable cause for your actions and didn't deliberately disregard IRS rules and regulations, the penalties don't apply. But the problem is the burden of proof is on the taxpayer to prove that the penalties don't apply. And so what I show you in the book is exactly step by step how to make a presentation to the IRS that will cancel the penalties and interest. And I can't tell you how many people have been freed of their tax debt just because they got rid of the penalties and interest.
I am so glad I met you today. I am so glad we're having this conversation. I could talk to you for the next 2 or 3 hours. I really could. But what I think I'm going to do, and what I think everyone else should do, is they should go to danpilla.com and get the book, How to Get Tax Amnesty. Dan Pilla, Daniel, but Dan because he's a friend of mine. Tell them how they can get the book.
Yeah, you go to my website, danpilla.com. You can order the book right off the site. If you order the book from my website, no other source, we'll give you a free consultation directly with me. That's danpilla.com, or you can call my phone number, 1-800-34-NO-TAX. That's 800-34-NOTAX, or danpilla.com, either one. Get the book and we'll give you a free consultation directly with me.
That's so if they that is great. They will literally get to talk to you if they order from danpilla.com.
Yes, me personally, yes.
danpilla.com. That's all there is to it. danpilla.com. Get the book, How to Get Tax Amnesty. And